So hello everyone. On behalf of Indian National Trust for Art and Cultural Heritage and the INTACH Conservation Institute, I extend a very warm welcome to our distinguished speaker, Ylva Dahnsjö, and everyone who has joined us today for today's talk in the Conservation Insights 2020 lecture series. I'm Dr. Padma Rohila, Director ICI Delhi. Now to introduce our speaker, Ylva Dahnsjö is an independent consultant for the conservation of art, material culture, and historic places. She was previously head of collections conservation at the National Trust for Scotland and a consultant conservator at the National Trust. Particularly interested in sustainability, materiality, and holistic approaches to the conservation of heritage. She is professionally accredited by the Institute of Conservation and a fellow of the International Institute of Conservation and of the Linnean Society of London. She is a past president of the European Confederation of Conservator Restorers Organization, ECCO, and served on the board of trustees of the Institute of Conservation. As you are aware, the title for today's talk is Places Where the Heart Lives, Approaches to conserving historic environments of complex emotional and spiritual significance and a culturally diverse group of stakeholders. For some time now, heritage organizations have been re-examining their core purpose, visions, resolutions, and ways of working. In the UK and elsewhere, campaigns to detox and decolonize museums, galleries, and cultural institutions have recently moved into higher gear following the global protests against racism and racial injustice. At the same time, the role of these institutions as impartial, just spaces are being ramped up by society as good alternative locations for statuary and other symbols of an unpalatable past that are no longer acceptable in our streets, but whose stories nevertheless need to remain in the public realm, their context illuminated and their narratives retold differently. This lecture revisits the major conservation projects of two very different buildings and their contents, both of huge cultural, spiritual, and emotional significance. Each had large and complex conservation challenges and a history of different interests within its extensive and diverse group of stakeholders. But the approach taken to bypass the stalemate in planning, decision-making, and communication was the same. So before I invite Ylva, may I please request all of you to please mute your microphones. We will be taking the questions and the discussion at the end of the talk. So please do type in the questions in the chat box and we'll be taking up those at the end of the talk. Thank you, Ylva, first of all, for accepting the invitation, and I welcome you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for being here. Thank you to Dr. Rohila for organising this series of extraordinarily rich and diverse lectures, all the more precious in this bizarre world that we currently live in. And thank you for giving me the opportunity of sharing some thoughts with you. As you've heard, I'm an independent conservator working with material culture. My work is to find holistic approaches to the protection, care, understanding and use of historic places and their collections. And my particular interest is in sustainability and green practices in all aspects of my professional practice. When I first started thinking about this talk, the UK had already been in lockdown because of the global pandemic for over 12 weeks. The death of George Floyd had just shocked the world and refueled anti-racism protests on a global scale and ramped them up to a new level of urgency. In the UK, the statue of Bristol merchant, philanthropist and slave trader Edward Colston had just been toppled into Bristol Harbour, and people were beginning to debate what to do with it next. The most frequently voiced option was to retrieve it from its temporary watery grave and to clean and stabilise it and take it out of the cityscape altogether. But then what? The most popular course of action, and indeed what has happened so far, was to put it into Bristol Museum, surrounded by its historical and social context, including many unpalatable truths about the foundations of Bristol's wealth for the last 400 years, and with new interpretation about this local man whose name as a benefactor appeared in so many places around the city, from a concert hall to street names and to school. When I wrote the abstract for this lecture, I spoke about museums as safe spaces, still in the public realm, but with the in-house historical knowledge and ability and will to tell uncomfortable narratives truthfully. I also acknowledged that in the UK, our cultural sector is on its knees financially because of the loss of at least half a year's visitors' income, now it's more, while bizarrely and at the same time as arts and culture in its widest sense was proving how absolutely central it is to our resilience as humans and for the sustenance of hope, empathy, imagination and creativity for the difficult times ahead. But how quickly things have moved on since then. There have been many more deaths fueled by racism, tragic, disgusting and preventable. To talk about inanimate objects adjacent to this statement seems disrespectful, but it is of course all very much connected. In the lecture, Conservation is not neutral and neither are we, the Director of Conservation and Preservation at the University of Florida Libraries, Fletcher Durant, shines a light on how far we still have to go as a sector to call ourselves diverse and just. We squirm in that spotlight, for we thought we were already enlightened, didn't we? Strangely enough, before I read the lecture, I thought that the title meant a good thing, and I hope my lecture will explain how. Please hear me out. Since my first thoughts, more statues have been toppled, been moved or projected out of sight or been recontextualized. The British Museum in London has moved the statue of its founder, Sir Hans Sloane, from its plinth outside the museum and given it a new place inside with new interpreted text that reminds us that the collecting habit of this 18th century physician and philanthropist was nevertheless financed by the profits of West Indian tobacco and sugar plantations worked by enslaved people. And in my current hometown of Edinburgh, we are still wrangling about what to do with the statue of Henry Dundas. Oh, I did not expect that. Are you seeing a picture of Henry Dundas?
Yes, Ylva, but yeah, if you could put it in full screen mode, yeah, better. Thank you.
First Viscount Melville, who used his influence as Home Secretary to delay the abolition of slavery by 15 years, and it's been calculated that he has resulted in the death of 630,000 people. His plinth, like Nelson's in Trafalgar Square, is probably the main reason why he has not found a watery grave in the Firth of Forth yet. And I will not honour him with more exposure. Instead, I will show you a picture that makes me very happy, and I will explain later why this is. And suddenly museums and galleries, which I use as a blanket term for all material cultural institutions and historic places, are acknowledging that they're not always neutral spaces for detoxing, decolonizing the collections through polite, grown-up debate, nor do they adequately reflect the diversity of UK society in their staff, especially in their senior management. And more fundamentally, what are museums for anyway? And how, hush, whisper it, the National Trust is even debating what its core purposes are. These debates are now, and as conservators, we're part of them. What is our role and our duties in this world without a safety net? So, I thought it would be useful to share two case histories with you and what I personally learned from them and how that's shaped my approach to my work. I hope they'll be of use and inspiration to you too for the difficult conversations, decisions and actions ahead. Both the stories are set in the southeast of England, where I worked as consultant conservator for the National Trust for England, Wales and Northern Ireland for 8 years. And the arrow points to that. But where I come from is where the arrow actually is starting, and that's where my people are from far, far north of the Arctic Circle in Sweden, and I have a drop or two of Sami blood racing through my veins. Educated in Spain, Sweden and England, I guess my outlook was not quite British in the two projects I shall describe, but then neither was anybody else's. Although the heritage sector in the UK is not socially mobile enough, We're doing very well indeed in terms of international mobility, not least because of the willingness of students and emerging professionals to travel. For example, the National Trust Core Project Group, working with the Maori Meeting House, Hinamihi, were born respectively in Canada, Germany, Sweden, Kenya, Greece, England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. And these are the ones I know, and we're just talking about what's in our passports here, and not our choice of home or our partners. As well, of course, as the main Maori and non-Maori colleagues from New Zealand. So why should we hide between a professional neutrality of culture? Does this actually benefit anybody? And incidentally, this is what I thought the Fletcher Durant lecture would be about. When I talked about the Hinamihi project in the very early days, a very senior colleague who was unconnected with it observed that in Maori eyes, you are either Maori or non-Maori. And she found this very black and white, very cut and dried, until I pointed out that wasn't that the same argument as being British or non-British, which she found more difficult to see. As a consultant conservator for the National Trust, I provided advice and support to a portfolio of National Trust properties in the wealthy London and South East region. And as you would expect, there were a lot of very grand country houses. This is Petworth House in Sussex, known as the Art Warehouse of the National Trust. Owned and managed by the National Trust, but with Lord and Lady Egremont, who are of the donor families, still resident in half of the property. And there were many Palladian houses with grand 18th century grand tour collections. And this is the North Gallery inside that house that we just saw, Petworth, with classical and neoclassical sculpture collections that were amassed by the third Earl of Egremont. And I ask you which one of these beings is still breathing. And because the collections are still in their context, they add up to a much more complete insight into the lives of those who have gone before. So this is one of my absolutely favourite objects, and I hope that Julia will revel in this Venetian pearl-coloured silk suit belonging to John Chute at the Vine. All the more exciting because it still bore the creases of the wearer 300 years ago. We know that he loved Italian opera and spent 12 years on his grand tour, only cut short by the unexpected inheritance of the damp and mouldy mansion in Hampshire. We know that he had gout and sometimes had to be carried to performances in a sedan chair, and that he was very conscious of not seeming to have become one of those ridiculed Italianized Brits known as macaronis on his return. So we have already, by the things that he left behind and the context in which he lived, got very close to him. My job was to advise on the exhibition, display, use and enjoyment of historic environments. Strangely enough, having to protect them from exactly the kind of use that they were designed for. So back to Petworth again, this is the carved room, which at the time of the third Earl was a dining room. And here it is laid out for the Wyndham family wedding. And if I ask you to look in the background here, beyond the statues on the lower register, and you can see the paintings, the landscapes by the painter J.M.W. Turner that were painted specifically for this space when it was used as a dining room in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. At the same event, part of my job as a conservator was to protect and manage the spaces from the exuberance of other inspired people, in this case a florist, and had to tactfully work with them to avoid unacceptable risk of damage to the collection. And of course, the management of projects of all kinds was my job, from works to the fabric of the buildings themselves. And here we have the protection of a chandelier in situ prior to work to the adjacent windows you can see behind. And of course, I was working with film crews shooting on site. And here is a picture from Scotland, actually, from Kuos Palace, and the shooting of a scene from Outlander, if anybody has seen that series. But not all houses were grand. And here we have the 1930s Nuffield Place near Oxford, home of the engineer and inventor William Morris, not the William Morris of arts and crafts, but of Morris Motor Industries, later Lord Nuffield. He was the Bill Gates of his age, a millionaire inventor who gave huge amounts of his fortune away annually to good causes, for example, to provide iron lungs to all hospitals in the Commonwealth. And this is how a millionaire lives. So inside Nuffield Place, this is Lord Nuffield's bedroom. You can see his hot water bottles and smoking paraphernalia. And if you're an inventor, this is what you have in your bedroom for those middle of the night ideas, a bedroom workshop in your wardrobe. I might add, Lady Nuffield slept elsewhere. So this is where he would get up in the middle of the night, open up his wardrobe and invent things. And of course, the pictures that I showed you before of the slippers come from 575 Wandsworth Road in London, which is an absolutely normal 2 up, 2 down English house. But it was the home of the Nigerian-born civil servant, mathematician and storyteller, fret worker and poet, Kadambi Asalachi. And walking into his house is like walking into a fairy tale from the whole world, because he decorated it with fretwork completely internally. And what I showed you before, and he made all this, the shelves and whatever. And of course, what I showed you are his slippers and his grooming kit. And there are some places that I really wish I could live in. Here we have the Homewood, which is the modernist home and office that architect Patrick Gwynne built for himself in 1938 and lived and worked in until his death in 2003. And his blue-green Aston Martin is still in the garage. And this is one of the interiors from the Homewood, full of 20th century design classics, Alvar Aalto, Charles and Ray Eames, and a Goldfinger, Bruno Mattsson, and so on. So this introduction was just to show you that I've had the privilege of working with some extremely unusual and more outrageously precious houses than the grand Palladian ones and the slick architecture that I've just showed. The two I'm going to speak about today are both tiny and have few tangible collections, but have an embedded value in their physical structure and internal space. And most of all, they have a very diverse stakeholder group and the complex and sophisticated set of challenges that this inevitably brings about. Let me tell you about them. So here we are, still in England, still in the 1920s, and you might be forgiven for thinking that this is an electricity substation of that era, as there are several of these nearby in Hampshire, looking more or less like this. However, this building is by the architect Lionel Godfrey Pearson, and it's in fact a chapel dedicated to the memory of Lieutenant Harrow Willoughby Sandon, who died of malaria after serving in the Salonika campaign in the First World War. The setting is pleasant, within an apple orchard with a wishing well and with views of Watership Down. But nothing prepares you for the interior. This building is based on Giotto's Arena Chapel in Padua, sometimes also called the Scrovegni Chapel. It is a holy box with murals, so-called, by the visionary English artist Sir Stanley Spencer. And this is a self-portrait of him in his early 20s. Stanley Spencer chose to depict scenes from the Bible and other important stories, but set in his native Hampshire village of Cookham. When he got the commission to provide the decorations for the memorial chapel for Harry Sandon, he exclaimed, "What ho, Giotto?" because this was his great plan. And I have here a slide of the interior of Sandham. It is entirely decorated by scenes from Spencer's time as a medical orderly with the British Army in Macedonia during the First World War and at the Beaufort Military Hospital in Bristol. It is dominated by a huge painting of the resurrection of the soldiers, which you will see at the end here, showing them rising up from their graves and handing in their crosses like any piece of military kit as they make their way to meet their maker, accompanied by the animals who had also lost their lives, now appropriately brought back to life. There is no electric light in this space. There is no entrance hall. You walk straight into a mind-blowing experience. And visitors spontaneously burst into tears as they enter, including the man who came to put up scaffolding during the restoration project. And this was the project that I was involved in, the 2014 to 18 centenary commemoration of the First World War, but a multifaceted project that aimed to improve the building envelope of the building itself by upgrading water handling systems and heating and insulation, repairing the floor where the Portland stone flagstones were cracked or delaminating, repairing brick paths outside the chapel, improving light management, and so on, and also taking the opportunity to clean and consolidate the paintings and improve their installation, mechanics, security, and emergency evacuation procedures. And all of this was to aid the increased access to Sandham Memorial Chapel for everybody, including those who are differently abled in various ways, and also to grow awareness of the Memorial Chapel, both in the local community and in the wider global community. And we also aim to initiate and formalize collaborations, for instance, with Help for Heroes, based at nearby Tedworth House, which is a charity that helps to heal and rehabilitate wounded service personnel. And we wanted to make a garden of remembrance. This was one of the problems with the actual paintings, and the way that the paintings are organized inside the chapel is that the lower register are called the predella paintings, and above them are the lunettes, and neither of those are actually murals, but canvas on wooden strainers that are fitted into recesses. In Spencer's very special style, he observes everyday kindness and heroism and the little things to do with military life. There is no violence and there is no blood. I'd like you to concentrate on the bottom right-hand corner of this painting, because this is the detail of it, showing how it fits in what is designed to be a push fit into the recess, and also the fact that Stanley Spencer had got the measurements slightly wrong and had to paint extensions to his own paintings when they were installed. You can also see that some of the paint on the surface is flaking because of the material he used and also because of the current internal environment. So the practical challenges were that the building work would be messy, there would be lots of dust, we weren't sure whether we should be protecting the paintings in situ, but it was also an opportunity, if we did deinstall the paintings, to exhibit them elsewhere. And Somerset House in London, which is a very grand exhibition gallery, Pallant House in Chichester, ditto, and Manchester Art Gallery all came forward as willing hosts for as exhibition spaces. But the timescale was absolutely crazy. We had 3 months, not the normal 9 months lead-in that we would normally expect from people who borrow things from the National Trust. And we also had another huge problem. The resurrection of the soldiers at the end is not removable. It is adhered to the wall because it is painted on a single piece of very expensive Belgian canvas. So there was no chance at all of moving that. But it's absolutely central to the painted scheme. And the timescale. The chapel is shown here without its seating, but you can see at the end that there is an altar with a cross on it, which then refers to the crosses in the painting, so that the people who are in the chapel feel that they are part of the resurrection scene. And this very special internal space is used for the Remembrance Sunday special service for about 30 military personnel and the local congregation. But we were proposing to close the scaffold, remove the paintings, and put in a lot of internal protection. And the local community and volunteers felt bereft of their paintings being away from the exhibition for so long. And there were also copyright issues with Sir Stanley Spencer's estate and Harry Sandon's surviving relatives. So as you can imagine, a space that can stimulate such strong responses has very strong pockets of support and vocal stakeholders. Luckily, the National Trust was just starting a big piece of work spearheaded by Sarah Staniforth, basing it on the ICOMOS definition of spirit of place in 2008. And so we were beginning to draw up statements of significance and spirit of place statements. As a requirement of museum accreditation, we already had some statements of significance for the really important properties. It really is a statement that outlines the whatness of a place. So it's a description of the history, features, and value of the property. And it's a synopsis of why the National Trust is caring for the place. But in addition, the new work was concentrated on a companion document, the Spirit of Place Statement, which aims to describe, in as few words as possible, the thisness of a place. These two concepts seem to have been first initiated in 13th century in the Western philosophy by Thomas Aquinas and Dahnsjö, the quidditas and the haxicitas, that is the whatness and the thisness of material culture. My question to you as the audience today is whether your cultures express themselves in the same ways and what the concepts might be called. So I'd be very grateful if you have the time and the inclination to contact me and tell me all about that, either in the question sections after the lecture or by email. So here is the ICOMOS definition. So the spirit of place refers to the unique, distinctive, and cherished aspects of a place. It is thus as much in the invisible weave of cultures, stories, memories, beliefs, histories, and so on, as it is in the tangible, physical aspects of a place: monuments, rivers, woods, architectural style, pathways, views, and so on. Or its interpersonal aspects, the presence of family, friends, and kindred spirits. And in a nutshell, this is what we came up with for Sandham's Spirit of Place Statement: a holy box of art and memory, of intimacy and complexity, of monument and soul. And this is the statement in full. And what I based that little quotation on, that I just read out, was this little poem at the bottom, which came out of one of the participants of the very important meeting to discuss and establish the spirit of place. It's not the best poem in the whole world, but I think that the very fact that it is a poem manages to speak very directly to other people, and there are phrases there which are very useful to draw out. So the Sandon project benefited from concerning a property that still had its context intact. The chapel had been designed and built specifically for Stanley Spencer to decorate, and it had stayed within that context geographically and functionally. Spencer's depiction is recognisably Christian, though it is personal, eccentric, and visionary all at once. It was therefore relatively easy to organise a meeting with all the major stakeholders, which included the local congregation and community, National Trust volunteers and staff, relatives of Harry Sandon and of Stanley Spencer, UK services personnel, Spencer scholars, National Trust consultancy staff and specialists, and so on, to generate the raw content for the content of the Spirit of Place statement, even though there were differences of opinion. What makes the Spirit of Place statement such a useful exercise is that it captures the important qualities of a place at a given moment in time. Unlike the statement of significance, it is subject to revision and change as often as is required. It gives the stakeholders the opportunity to represent their own emotional response to a place without taking on the guilt of problematic aspects of history that they are not personally responsible for. That is not to say that such a history should be glossed over or left out, but making a statement for the present, where everybody's emotional responses are valid, certainly, I missed out a page here. Sorry. Well, it's certainly a good place to start. As part of this project, a visit was also organised to Somerset House for the National Trust volunteers at Sandon. So instead of losing the exhibition, the pictures that went to the exhibition, they travelled with the exhibition and saw their cherished paintings in a completely different space and context, and therefore felt more ownership and connection with those.
Ylva, sorry to interrupt, but people, the audio quality is low. Can you increase the volume of your thing?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah?
Is that better?
Yeah, much better.
Okay. Where I think I lost a couple of pages in my printout here is what I said that the solution was to leave the resurrection exactly where it was and to protect it in situ so that the building works could go ahead. And we were able to add more interpretation to that painting alone. So here is a rather messy little sketch, but it's actually from Sir Stanley Spencer's own studio, and there's that staining that you can see are blobs of oil from where he was mixing the paint. And what this little cartoon shows is proof of a feature of the resurrection which was contested at the time of the installation and has been really ever since, and that is whether he intended for the animals to be part of the resurrection from the very beginning, because that would imply that they had souls. This is not an alien concept for us now, but at the time it was very controversial, so much so that the chapel was actually consecrated by the bishop without the resurrection installed. And this is a screenshot from a blog about the exhibition at Somerset House, and you can see that we've been able to approximate the hang of the paintings as they are in the chapel, but of course there is nothing at the end where the resurrection would have been. But instead there was the opportunity to juxtapose the paintings with other paintings of significance for the chapel, as you can see above. And this is another screenshot of how the absence of the resurrection painting was resolved in that it had a room all to itself, and its place was taken by a projected image of the painting. The lights were low, there were music, and if you look on the adjacent wall, you can see that there is a poem there that has connection with the painting. And if you look on the comments beneath these images, you can see that the blogger says that he's been drawn in to actually go to an exhibition of National Trust paintings that he would never have gone to in the past. So from that point of view, it was a success in spreading the word about Sandon. And if you ever get the opportunity to go there, I would thoroughly recommend it. By contrast with Sandon, then, I should say that the homecoming and reinstallation of the conserved paintings at the end of the tour and the completion of the project was a big celebration. And totally out of its context, geographically, culturally, and functionally. And I've been told that my internet connection is unstable, but I shall persevere. So we're still in the south of England in terms of where the project was, but the subject of the project came halfway across the world from New Zealand, North Island. I'm sorry, I haven't quite got the beginning of the arrow properly in the right place. So this is the journey of Hinemihi, the Maori Wharenui, or meeting house, who travelled from Rotorua on New Zealand's North Island to Clandon, another Palladian villa on the outskirts of Guildford in Surrey. Meeting houses are considered the embodiments of ancestors and therefore sentient, so Hinemihi's pronouns are she, her, and hers. Hinemihi herself was a brave and fierce female ancestor whose pet dragon can be seen carved into the interior decorations. So if you look above the figure of the carved pole in the middle, you will see that there is a creature that is in fact a dragon. It is not for me to tell the story of Hinemihi or to speak on her behalf. She has her own people to do this, both in her own iwi, that is tribe, Ngāti Hinemihi back in New Zealand, and the bigger Ngāti Ranana, the Maori diaspora group in London. But I did have the honour of working in the committee for her restoration, together with the group Te Maori o Hinemihi and others. And you can go on to Te Mao's website and see the people who are directly involved with that. An amazing collection of curators, poets, body adornment artists, performers. That's just Rosander Raymond there in the bottom right-hand corner. Architects, conservators, a lawyer, a journalist, an educator, and a living national treasure in Maori weaving. And many other talented people who I had the privilege of working with during my time at the National Trust. And what I really want to talk about is what this privilege did for me and my understanding of what conservation is. So in a nutshell, because it is important to understand the background to why Hinemihi was at Clandon and still is, she was made by her people in Te Wairau in 1880 and had particularly fine carvings made by a legendary Maori carver. A meeting house within its Waiwa Marae is a cultural space that performs many functions for its community. It is a place for important meetings, ceremonies, storytelling, and performance. In 1886, the volcanic Mount Taravera erupted, spreading lava and deadly hot ash in a thick layer over the area, and Hinemihi became a sanctuary and literally a lifesaver for a great part of her tribe, while all others perished. So therefore, any present-day people from Ngāti Hinemihi owe her their life, literally. In 1892, Lord Onslow was finishing his tenure as Governor of New Zealand, and bought Hinamihi as a souvenir for £50. The ground she stood on is barren and forbidden, tapu, and so she could not be used by her iwi, and they chose to sell her. She was therefore dismantled and transported to Clarendon in pieces, and afterwards re-erected near the lake. In 1934, she was moved to a more prominent position nearer the big house, which also allowed for a proper marae area in front in latter times. The National Trust acquired Clarendon in 1956 and has been considered ultimately responsible for Hinamihi since then. However, there's been an acknowledgement in recent years that the responsibility for Hinamihi is shared, especially in the light of calls for her to be returned to New Zealand. Dean Sully's excellent book, Decolonize and Conservation, published 2007, brings together many essays from different stakeholders and marks a new willingness on all sides to understand and collaborate. More importantly, Hinamihi's journey has come to symbolize those who've also traveled halfway across the world to be in the UK. She is a traveler and a survivor. Excuse me. There are only 4 Maori meeting houses outside New Zealand, and she is the only one not in a museum. As a 19th century meeting house that has remained unchanged where others have been evolving with the times, she is particularly precious. And she needs her people to keep her warm. Therefore, Ngāti Ranana use her for their annual Hangi celebration of sharing food and performances, for teaching and for ceremonies, and for many other things besides. In 2012, the New Zealand Olympic team visited Hinamihi to be officially welcomed and blessed. One of the objectives of the restoration project is to sensitively add facilities to make it possible for members of Ngāti Ranana and others to stay overnight, cook food, and take showers and so on. It took us quite a while for us in the National Trust to understand how necessary this was, tasked as we were to generally stop things from happening in historic places. And here is quite an old slide of Ngāti Ranana at a Hangi performance. Now, this slide may give the impression of a performance to entertain an audience, but it is so much better than that. Part of the ways of keeping Hinamihi warm is generosity in sharing cultural activity and knowledge. The Hangi events at Clarendon are a sharing of food and culture open to all. And this is where I think it would be wrong for me to be culturally neutral and not bring my own culture to the table. We all do this unconsciously, of course, but I think it should be a matter of conscious generosity to share insights into other ways of living. So during my work with Hinamihi, I wore ancestral jewelry from my tradition. I showed my mother's weaving. I talked about the midnight sun and weaving chandeliers out of grass before midsummer. I talked of strange food and snow lanterns and important rituals for the marking of the seasons in my Nordic calendar. It made me feel less like the wall of spectators of someone else's culture, which is what this picture might be interpreted as. And I think it gives me license to go deeper into what I'm being invited to share without fear of being accused of cultural tourism or appropriation. The project meetings we had always followed Maori protocol, which put a great emphasis on mutual respect and everybody having a say. This meant that the stakeholder meetings were already a formal space for individual expression. The sharing of food was also an important part, a brilliant way for us all to bring our respective cultures to the table without the need for words. At the Sander Memorial Chapel project, we had to work with a facilitator to get the same feel to these stakeholder meetings. With Hinamihi, the work on Spirit of Place had not yet kicked off in the National Trust when we started the restoration project, but we didn't actually need it. What I learned was that heritage is something that a Maori person carries within them, in their DNA. Well, we all do. Of course we do, but how could it be otherwise? But my European training in conservation had somehow concentrated solely on the caring for the materiality of heritage, without caring for the people who create it or those who keep it warm. The performance artist, academic, curator, poet, and generally impressive professional, Rosanna Raymond, writes brilliantly about her art and the Polynesian concept of the fa, that is, the space between things and people. Once it is consciously opened up, that space brings mutual benefit and responsibility. Her, I think, unpublished lecture in Cambridge, putting the fa back into conservation, totally changed the way I looked at my own work as a conservator. I've both lightened up in my conservation practice and become more careful with other people's culture. I see conservation as a dynamic part of the continuous life of material culture, not as an end station. And I trust my visceral responses to material culture more. As long as we are clear in our intentions as regards conservation, restoration, and creation, we can afford to move between these activities with confidence and pride. It is not that I necessarily think Maori culture is better or worse than any other, but I happen to think that Maori people express their relationship with taonga, that is, heritage and treasure, in the same concept, much better than we have been doing in European culture recently, and we should take inspiration from them. This rather blurry slide of a display case at the British Museum that has Maori objects and concepts, and the image was hurriedly taken at my request by a lovely colleague at the British Museum, so I apologise for it being difficult to interpret like this. But it talks about sustaining each other under the banner of general climate sustainability. Now, what is stopping us all from expressing our respective cultural values with equal confidence? Will the pandemic lockdown have helped us to better examine and formulate what we value about our culture? I hope so. As part of the restoration project, it was decided to make new internal decoration panels known as turapa or Tokutoku Panels. These are made from reeds, wooden slats and woven patterns of split New Zealand flax. And all interested parties from the stakeholder groups were invited to be trained by the legendary weaver, Cathy Schuster, who came over from New Zealand especially for this purpose. And we were using Watt Architecture's insanely trendy studio in London. The flax can only be harvested in January and needs long preparation and also an export license from New Zealand into the UK. And Cathy and Jim Schuster all organised this. So it was a long-awaited moment when they arrived with the bundles of flax in the UK. And we organised ourselves, including children who came along with their parents and did work that was every bit as intricate and well executed as anybody else's. We were organised into teams of 3 and each team was issued with separate pattern instructions. And this is our panel. So beside myself, my team existed of a conservator from the Bristol Museum in London and architectural editor working for Norman Foster, both from New Zealand, neither of them Maori, but with very strong insights into New Zealand culture. Cathy had given us the 3 patterns, the whale's backbone, the albatross's tears, and the myriad of stars. And if you think this looks a bit irregular, this is because the flax and the reeds are natural irregular materials. And this is a close-up of the 2 patterns. So we've got the myriad of stars at the top and the albatross's tears underneath. As natural irregular materials, they have to be respected. Every single little scrap of waste flax and trimmings is collected and becomes parakoka, that is material to be returned to the earth with thanks at a suitable time and place. No eating or drinking is allowed while weaving, but you can gossip. And what I didn't realise was that Hinamihi was quietly weaving us all together, and that I have a lovely support network of friends and colleagues who still keep in touch. The panel took about 4 Saturdays to make. with breaks for lavish lunches. And I think we never wanted to finish it at all, so we may make another one. So in conclusion, really, here is another blurry slide of the British Museum case, and I'm sure you can glimpse Hinamihi in the background there, just behind the shoulders of the dancers. The Te Maru o Hinamihi website eloquently speaks of her role as an ambassador for Maori culture and as a creative meeting place for New Zealand and British culture. And I think I would add that there are many, many more cultures present there in the far. In fact, the wording on the website is very much what we try to achieve somewhat artificially in the Spirit of Place statements elsewhere in the Trust. Through my involvement with Hinamihi and the generous sharing of culture that I experienced there, I've not just gained a more visceral knowledge and understanding of Maori culture, but it has helped me to examine and refresh my relationship with my own roots and with other cultures too. I've shown you two very different projects today. Excuse me. What do these tiny houses have to do with toppled statues and contested heritage? Well, I've tried to illustrate how the revisiting of tangible and intangible values and aspirations among all the relevant stakeholders in open and respectful meetings and capturing the results in something like a statement of significance and Spirit of Place statement is an essential investment of resource at the very beginning of any significant project or activity. Our newfound skills with Zoom should make the organisation and attendance at these meetings much less onerous than physical attendance used to be. And if we consciously bring the best of our own cultures to the table in a spirit of generosity, I think we can afford to leave the inherited baggage of previous generations at the door for a while and find meeting points and ways forward in a space where we just represent our best selves in the now. And then we should actively work with every fibre in our bodies to right the wrongs of the past where we can and to make the present and future better. I hope you liked hearing about some of the places where my heart lives, and it lives there in the company of many, many others. Thank you.
Thank you, Ylva. I think that was a very thought-provoking and a very interesting talk. There are no questions. I think people are still trying to absorb all this. Any questions? I have, it's not a question, it's just given that both the examples, there was a stakeholder group which knew about the significance and which was also there as a, let's say, as a guardian for that particular heritage. So what happens to any heritage which does not have so-called, orphaned heritage, which does not have any vested group stakeholder? But what do you do with those heritage places where, the stakeholders are either abandoned, gone away, and it's very difficult to, in fact, also find a statement of significance sometimes, or to just, give it. Of course, the ones, classical ones, the ones that we know, the standard ones, of course, can be given, but beyond that, the spirit of place, sense of place, everything is kind of, disappeared, let's assume. Then what do we do with those? How do you reckon we should proceed with those sites or places?
Well, there are always stakeholders, but they may not be the obvious ones. What I was talking about working in the now is that we need to quantify who the stakeholders now are. So if you are talking about a particular piece of heritage, then you are one of the stakeholders, obviously, as somebody who works with heritage and so on. Local communities, possible stakeholders for the future, also bringing groups in, bringing new generations and people who may not necessarily have been granted access to these places or who may not physically be able to access them because of difficulties of getting in, or of other obstacles, or whether it's not safe, whether you can't go in if you are if you can't see very well, or if you can't move very well, and so on. And as for the statement of significance and the spiritual place statements, if you are considering these pieces of heritage, then you have to construct those if you want to go forward. And I think that it is perfectly legitimate to start doing so, as long as you involve all the people that you know should have a say, and to create that respectful place where everybody can speak.
Yeah, thank you. We have a small query. This is, I think Julia wants to know. Name of the author you mentioned who defined the space between things and people.
The name of the author?
Yeah.
Yes. It's Rosanna Raymond, and she is both a poet and curator and performer and writer and performance artist. She's also a consultant for the play and interpretation of Maori collections in the UK and elsewhere. And so I know that she had a hand in how that display case and the interpretation from the British Museum was organised. And she also, well, she works globally. And she also works with Maya Nuku, who I know is a curator who is working in the States. I can't quite remember which organisation, San Francisco maybe. Yeah, so you can Google these professionals and follow their links, and there's some stunning visual material there, and much poetry.
Okay, we have a small we have a question. Is Diptarka Datta, and she's saying, in third world countries like India, where conservation and heritage practices are underfinanced and incompletely understood, how do we go forward with institutionalization of institutionalized conservation of private buildings and memorials, which nevertheless have historic value but are limited in terms of stakeholders and emotive appeal? I mean, she's looking at diverse communities and again contested memories within that space when it comes to this heritage.
Yeah. I think that you have to, first of all, establish exactly what it is that you want to achieve. And that's why I said, really at the beginning of each activity, you have to take many steps back to make sure that what your objectives are still relevant. As conservators, I think we have a very well rehearsed course of action when we draw up a conservation plan for a project, for a place or an object, and also when we assess condition and so on. But I think we are mature enough now as a profession to acknowledge that there are different ways of looking at decay and the desired state of a piece of heritage. And so those conversations where we explore that with many different stakeholders are so valuable and so central to what happens next. And it may be that the physical restoration and conservation of a piece of neglected cultural heritage may not be quite as all-encompassing as a conservator might first think. You know, we always want to do the Rolls-Royce treatment if we can, but we might settle for the, Volkswagen or the I was going to say Skoda treatment, but Skodas are really good now. So whatever is sort of on the economy end of the scale, but nevertheless to do well thought out, benign interventions. And I think this concept of keeping the heritage warm by those who have direct connections with it is very much part of the conservation activity, and that's what I think I've learned from these projects.
Okay. Thank you. The next question is from Nick. He's asking, did the Hinimi survive the 2015 fire at Clarendon?
Indeed, yes. I've got a bit of a postscript here. For some of you may well know that there was in 2015 there was a horrendous fire at Clarendon, and it gutted most of the interior of the mansion house. And some of Hinemi's supporters actually organised for there to be a fire guard standing by her day and night while the fire was being put out in the mansion. And she did not suffer any damage at all. But now, of course, there is a project that aims to reconstruct and create new parts of the mansion itself, and so it has opened up the debate of what Hinemi's role is with Clarendon. And there was a piece of news at the end of last year. The National Trust has agreed in principle that there can be a swap of Hinemi's 19th century carvings with some new carvings made by Maori craftsmen with the appropriate materials and of course the appropriate protocol at all stages. So it's a physical exchange that may happen. Now, of course, with the great interrupter of the coronavirus,
yeah,
we'll see what happens. But
yeah. Thank you. The next question is related to aspect of subjectivity and negotiation amongst communities and their contested memories. So in simple words, say it's somebody's family's memory house, and it's not actually community's heritage. And if one wants to institutionalize or preserve such buildings, how does one go about it?
As people say, that's an excellent question. I think I'm going about it very, very carefully, and make sure that no assumptions are made about the way forward before all voices have been heard. I talked about the sort of neutrality of the professional neutrality of the conservator, and maybe the imagined neutrality of an institution, but none of us and no institutions ever are neutral. So there's always the sort of the need for finding those meeting points and creating spaces for informed discussion, open discussion, and respectful. Sorry, I'm sort of reiterating what I said before, but I think the question was slightly before as well. But I am, of course, acknowledging that much heritage has such painful associations that it is very, very difficult to proceed. But that doesn't mean to say that we can't, because hopefully those of us active in the field now, none of us are personally responsible for those painful histories, even though culturally we may be. And I think the recognition of that mutually is the way forward.
The next question is, what happens to places where the significance and sense of place has been preserved through some intangible cultures, which might be spiritual in nature, but at the same time, as the years pass by, the sustainability of these places becomes difficult due to the evolution of those cultures in a different way? How to conserve these places as well as the cultures in a sustainable way?
Well, I think that we have shown during the pandemic lockdown that there are alternative ways of accessing and sharing culture altogether in all its manifestations, and that these can in some instances be more cost effective, quicker, easier to set up and use. But I think it would be, and you know, there are all sorts of possibilities here, providing remote or hybrid access to cultural places. But that doesn't mean to say that we can mothball these places and come back to them in 10 years' time and expect to find them in the same state of preservation or lack of that we last left them in. So I think that it is very important for the two halves of hybrid access, the in-person, on-site access, and the virtual access to develop hand in hand, and for one never to eclipse the other. Because virtual access gives one more opportunities of interpretation and making connections that will explain that heritage in an easier way than being on site. But I think it never take the place of standing in a spiritual or significant place and experiencing it with all your senses.
Thank you. This question is again from Julia. She said, the final public weaving activity is so simple yet powerful. How did this work for children, families, and connect them to the project and place? Would you recommend utilizing weaving in a more broad way for education?
That's from a textile conservator, of course. Well, it's interesting because all cultures, I think, that practice weaving also have stories and myths that are to do with weaving lives together. I mean, in the Nordic countries, we have the Norns, the three Norns who spin the thread of your life and then weave it and then cut it off. And I think most cultures have fibers and textiles, because of the way we use fibers, have that as a metaphor also for other things. And so therefore weaving is an excellent activity. You wanted me to say that, didn't you? For bringing people together. And also it's a fantastic skill. The panels that I showed you, you actually have, when you're weaving, you have the panel fixed upright, and then you have one person sitting on one side and the person sitting on the other side, and we have to communicate, because we have to say which way round the sliver of flax has to go, because it's slightly rounded, so puku up or puku down. So you're always talking, and that's why the sort of gossiping is just a natural progression from that. And I must say that the the Maori people who brought their children to the workshop in London didn't give their children the weaving, or they actually did painting. They didn't give them their tasks in a sort of childlike, simplified way. Their instructions were exactly the same as the adults, and it was a messy job, as you can imagine, you know, black and red paint and so on. And these children were, I don't know, 8, 10 years old, and they were every bit as skilled and as careful as we adults thought we were. So yes, weaving for all.
Thank you. I'm sharing your email ID, Ylva, if it's okay with you. Yeah. So the email ID is there. So I don't think there are any more questions. So thank you so much for this presentation. I'm sure everybody is now thinking about, you know, conservation and contested spaces. It's a lot to talk about, you know, stakeholder assessments, getting a broader spectrum of values in place so that no one has a lot to work with and weave through. I think that's one way to go about it. So yeah, please do write to Ylva as she requested your opinions. She would love to hear. And thank you so much again. Thank you everyone for joining us. So.